when you're thinking about growing out a sales team and hiring sales folks who go sell into developers, like, is there a specific profile you look for because you're selling into developers, or does it really not matter and they just sort of have those sales skills? And then the sort of flip side of that question is like, do you need to mold the training program in a different way because you are selling to a more technical audience? Like, how do you sort of think about that problem?
Yeah, early on, this was definitely true, where we would mostly hire people that had already sold to developers. And it's interesting because they understood that with that persona at that time, also, I think developer sales has changed a lot in the last couple of years. But with that persona at that time, when really for the first time in the market, developers were a buying engine. They were kind of a buying center. Before that, it wasn't really like, before they were able to run credit cards and do their own trials and stuff like that. It wasn't how it worked. Like SaaS really allowed this. Before then, it was mostly IT teams that were able to buy stuff because everything had to be deployed and installed on-prem. Now, when things are just, download this trial and get going, obviously, it really changed the dynamics, the power dynamics. So we mostly hired folks that had previously sold to developers because they understood developers want to see a lot of value up front. Like they, especially when it's smaller deal IC driven at that time, they don't necessarily so much care about like the vision of where you're going to go as a company. They need some support on like solving their particular problem. Like they really want to figure out, like, I have X thing that I need to do, help me get that thing done. So the initial sales team was really focused on what I would call, what the market calls product sales, which is like, you're a real expert on the product and like all the speeds and feeds, and you collect the customers problem, and you try to figure out how you can wedge your product into that set of problems. That is great and fine, and it allowed us to grow quite a bit. But over time, we had to move from product sales to solution sales, and that's a much bigger leap to take. And the kind of seller that we brought in when we needed to make that leap was different. We were able to like enable and train some of the folks we had for sure, but in general, we would start with folks. In the early days, we started with folks that had sold to developers. In the later stages, we started with folks that had sold complex solutions. We preferred if it was like, in the part of the infrastructure stack, but there was definitely more of an emphasis on sales regimen and sales skills and that experience versus necessarily the being able to talk to developers piece.
And you had mentioned at the beginning, like LaunchDarkly was sort of your first shot, I guess, like really running a whole org, right? That's what you wanted. I guess you're at Scuba Analytics right before, and you didn't get that chance there for good reasons. And so this was sort of your first shot. I'm like, I wonder how that was for you on a personal level. Like, what was the hardest part about doing all this? How were you able to kind of figure it out and manage kind of this new role? Because you had never done this job before.
Yeah. I always tell people that having a really strong mentor is like worth its weight in gold. Having people that you can go to help ask those questions that you feel are kind of like silly questions. You're like, oh man, like I don't want to ask someone, but I don't know how I should structure a comp plan for an SDR. Like, what should I do here? Like, and like having that community of people that can help walk you through stuff is amazing. Like that's definitely something that I think is needed. And then also eventually realizing that none of this stuff is like no one is like just born knowing the blocking and tackling operational stuff. Some people are great sellers because they're naturally great presenters, or, they're very charismatic, or they have, great relationships or a great network. But even those folks, once they go into leading a team or even managing a team, a lot of those dynamics are new. So trying to move past that imposter syndrome and just understanding like it's more important that I recognize my gaps than to try to ignore them. Like knowing that they're a gap, I can actually start working towards them. Not knowing that it's a gap, it's just gonna continue to be a problem. So that was a big transition. I think in the beginning, I will emphasize the importance of hiring. We had a really strong team that allowed me to maybe not be as concerned with like the day to day, like how was that call? Like, did we say the right things? Did we make sure we didn't offend anyone? Like it was a team that was like really able to handle the majority of the day to day tasks. We would need some direction, and we would review stuff, and we would review calls, and we would go through best practices. But they were really, really capable and competent, and that gave me the ability to go focus on how we were actually going to scale the team. The last thing I'll mention on that is everything is very a lot of this is based on where the company is at the time and what it needs. Again, it's an enviable position to come into a company and having the first thing you need to do is really scale. Like that's not always what happens. Oftentimes you have to come in and, like as you mentioned, what you have to do is you need to figure out what is the product market fit, what is the value, what is the competitive landscape. And so it's, the things you would do would be slightly different. But when the product market fit is really strong and you already have some demand coming in and you can just focus on the challenges of scaling, it doesn't make it any easier, but it allows you to focus a lot more.